Our speaker tonight is Mr. Dean Smith. He is a noted attorney in Akron, as well as a noted historian. His topic tonight is the Stalingrad, the Siege of Stalingrad. And it should be noted that Mr. Smith is a co-creator of the World War II Korean War Roundtable that takes part every month in Fair Lawn, Ohio. And I went to them, and early on when we started this, and would always ask for who their speakers were, and I would always get their speakers, steal their speakers from them, because they are wonderful, as is Mr. Smith, who was one of their speakers also. The Roundtable in Fair Lawn has been in operation for 5 years?
It'll be 7 years in August.
Oh, 7 years, okay, well, great. So, with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Dean Smith.
First of all, I need to tell you how the group was organized. For years, I belonged to the Civil War Roundtable, and one night we were discussing the fact that maybe we should do something with the World War II veterans before they all die. And so we had our first meeting almost 7 years ago. Started out with 13 were present. We have like 210 members now, and we average between 80 and 140 at our meetings. And we do record our meetings as well, and we send a copy up to the University of Akron Archives, plus our own members can use and borrow them or buy them for $10. So that's kind of how we started. Then we decided the Korean War was only 5 years later, so let's include the Korean War. So that's why we call it our World War II Korean War Roundtable. And so that's kind of how it was established. And our first speaker happened to be a German soldier. I ran into him one time in traffic court. And he wanted to know what was going to happen, and I was kind of explaining it to him, and he said, I said, "You have a ticket?" He says, "No, I'm here as an interpreter." And I said, "Oh," he says, "Yeah, I speak 7 languages, and I'm an interpreter." And he was an interpreter there that day for a Russian who couldn't speak English. And so he's kind of interested. I said, "Well, where'd you learn 7 languages?" Well, he says, "I'll tell you, I was in 3 different armies. I was wounded 3 times and a prisoner of war 5 times. Well, you know, how could you do that? Well, he was of German descent, was one of what they called the Volga Germans. And so his family was a very active family in the Communist Party. So he went into the Russian army as an officer. He was in Poland. Then he went up with the infantry into Finland, which was a disaster. Lost all, most of the troops were wiped out. And then when the Germans attacked, he then again was with kind of a National Guard outfit. And anyway, he was captured by the Germans. And they released him then. And so many of the Germans that were living in the Volga area, Stalin decided that they were bad, and he killed many of them, including many of his relatives, and shipped the rest of them to Siberia just because they were German. And so he decided, well, I'm going to join the German army. Well, when he was fighting in Finland, he belonged to what they called the Finnish Communist Army. But they were not Finns, they were Russians. And so that was the 2nd Army. Then when he joined the German army, that was the 3rd Army, and he spent the rest of the war then in the German army. Well, he was quite an interesting fellow, one of our members, so that started it off. Did you not also have Gunther Ertel here, the German soldier who was on the Russian front, I think? Yeah, we've used him, and he's one of our members. We had a Russian soldier who was at the Battle of Kursk. It's his first big battle, very descriptive. Unfortunately, he died a year after he did his presentation. But we've covered a lot of areas, and of course we're looking for speakers too, and we hope to continue this. How many World War II veterans we have here? Okay, quite a few. How many Korean War veterans we have here? Okay. How many Vietnam veterans do we have here? Okay. Iraq? And, okay. Cold War veterans. A lot of, okay. Okay, all right. Okay. To get information on Stalingrad for many years was very difficult. We didn't have access to Russian history, and there weren't too many Germans that survived, or did they want to write too much about the Battle of Stalingrad. So there weren't too many books out on Stalingrad until recent years, and there have been a few books. And when I did my presentation, Gunther Erthel worked with me that night. And the best book is a book by an Englishman by the name of Anthony Beaver. And he spent extensive research and time in Russia and gathered a lot of information. And so what I'm going to give you is kind of a statistical report. And I think when you put this all together, you'll understand a little bit what really happened. Stalingrad, 1942, the turning point and the start of the German defeat in Russia. Now, I might mention the night that I did this, Ertel said, in his opinion, it was not the Battle of Stalingrad, but the Battle of Moscow that preceded this. He was in the Battle of Moscow. He said, we lost 1 million troops at Moscow. That was, in his opinion, the turning point. But the history books will say it's Stalingrad because of all the publicity. First, we need to understand some of the facts and events that led to the war and the battle. Russia is 40 times the size of France, 39 times the size of Germany. Between 1937-39, 35,000 Army officers were removed from the Red Army. A shocker occurred in August 1939 with a Soviet-Nazi non-aggression pact. Shocked everybody, but it was more of a trade, and probably neither party ever intended to really honor it. And then August of 1939, a very short war between Russia and Japan. This lasted for a couple of months. General Zhukov was the hero in turning back the Japanese. This was up in Manchukuo. About 20,000 casualties on both sides. But again, not too much publicity about that little war that took place. September 1939, Poland was attacked by Germany. Russia comes in later, takes part of eastern Poland. Also, this gives an excuse for Russia to take Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and part of Romania. November in 1939, the Red Army, in an ill-judged and ill-timed attack on Finland. The Russian army suffered 470,000 casualties from the Finns. During this time, the trade between Russia and Germany was tremendous. At this point, but Hitler now wanted the oil, the natural gas, the animals, the wheat, the sugar beets, the citrus fruits, all that was there in Russia for himself. Also, Hitler had a hatred of communism and no respect for the Slavic people. Also, Stalin refused to heed countless warnings from his own spies, Western governments, when we had broken the German code, and he did not allow the military leaders to put their armies on alert. Many of the Allies agreed that Russia would collapse if attacked. A commander of a panzer division told his troops, the war with Russia will last only 4 weeks. The invasion. What happened and what mistakes were made? Hitler sent his armies, 3 million troops, into Russia in late June 1941 without winter clothing. 3 major invasions: to the north towards Leningrad, central towards Moscow, in the south towards the Caucasus. Believe it or not, Germany only had 1,400 tanks to begin the war. There was an immediate shortage of ammunition and fuel. Hitler expected Japan to attack from the east. Sorge, probably the most famous spy from World War II, confirmed to Russia that Japan will not attack. Germany estimated that Russia could only raise 200 divisions. Incidentally, they raised 360 divisions and had over 30 million soldiers during the war. 30 million soldiers in the Russian army. Germany estimated Russia had few reserves. Actually, Russia's reserves were 5 times German estimates. 2 million in the east watching Japan. In the spring of 1942, the reserves alone were half as strong as the entire German force in Russia. The campaign in the Balkans delayed the invasion for 8 weeks. They planned, this was delayed. They hoped to go through Yugoslavia and make that southern attack, but Yugoslavia would not let the troops come through. So the German armies attacked Yugoslavia, and then the Germans got drawn into the war with Greece because the Italians had attacked and had failed. But that delayed the invasion for 8 weeks. Then the rain came, turned the roads into mud. The railroads had the wrong size track for the German locomotives. German supply lines were 1,000 kilometers long. Hitler assessed 8 to 10 weeks to crush Russia. General Jodl told his staff, "Gentlemen, it is not a question for discussion, but a decision by the Fuhrer." American experts thought it would be over in 3 months, except General MacArthur. He used the war between Japan and China that had gone on for 8 years. That war, incidentally, started in 1931, and said that Germany did not have the numbers to conquer such space with the Blitz. The front line became 2,000 miles long from Finland to the southern point. Russia moved its heavy industry east and in 5 months moved 1,523 large plants. United States and Allied involvement. By 1943, United States had supplied 3,000 airplanes. These were the B-40s. 2,400 tanks and 80,000 Studebaker trucks, 2,000 locomotives, and 13 million pairs of insulated boots. The Red Army, after 1.5 years, had learned a lot. The Russian T-34 tanks with a diesel engine, which was invented by an American engineer, became the dominant tank. Soviets also introduced the Kayuska, that's the Soviet rocket launchers, in late 1942. Russia had also learned to develop mass production methods. Russia had cold weather gear, which saved thousands of lives of the Red Army. Russian propaganda became effective. Rodina, death is inseparable from victory. Also, the Germans underestimated the Red Army soldier. The initial battles in prelude to Stalingrad, Ambassador General Ribbentrop, who was on the day of the German attack in Russia, was called upon by the Russian ambassador Peganov to see him. Ribbentrop said, "The Fuhrer has charged me with informing you officially of these defensive measures." Peganov replied, "You will regret this provocative attack. You will pay dearly for it." Ribbentrop was sad and whispered, "Tell them in Moscow that I was against the attack." The German plan was to plunge forward, forget about the flanks and rear, disorganize the enemy, and disrupt the communications and destroy them. The incompetency of the Russian generals initially saved the Germans. In the first 5 months, Russia lost 17,000 tanks, and 2/3 of the crewmen died. However, by 1942, Russia produced 24,500 tanks, and the Russians only produced 5,000. The Red Army, during this period of time, was destroyed and renewed at least twice during the war. The first day of June 22nd, the Soviets lost 1,200 planes alone. Most of them were caught on the ground. After 6 months, the Red Army had lost 4.5 million men. 2.5 million were prisoners. In the Kiel campaign, the Red Army had 700,000 killed. The Battle of Smolensk, the Red Army lost 300,000 prisoners and 3,000 tanks. The Battle of Moscow, which I mentioned previously, heavy fighting, had a call to arms of all civilians. Russia killed 5,000 deserters and 12,000 for evading military services in Moscow. During the war, Russia executed 158,000 men. They set up penal battalions. 80% would be set up with machine guns behind them, so they were what they called blocking troops. Many of them went forward even without guns. Propaganda became effective. Began to talk about motherland for Stalin. Order 227, not a step back. Russia passed out 11 million decorations. They introduced 800,000 women into the army. By the end of November 1941, Germany had lost 143,112 men killed, wounded, and captured, and only 100,000 replacements. By February 1942, for every German that had been killed up to this point, 20 Soviet soldiers had died. The summer of 1942, the Romanian forces had suffered 98,000 casualties in the Battle of Odessa. The Romanian forces were fighting with the Germans. Romania, to replace their losses on the Russian front, they drafted the convicts, many convicts, just to fill the ranks. The start of the battle, the Stalingrad front was a 300-mile front. Now, the Battle of Waterloo was only a mile or two. The Battle of Gettysburg was 3 miles. Here was a 300-mile front. Hitler's plans were a bit unrealistic. In the spring of 1942, Army Group South was in a weak position to begin a drive into the Caucasus. They only had petroleum to July. Luftwaffe was at half strength. The armored motor vehicles were in short supply. Hitler's staff recommended to continue eastward to Moscow and cut off the railroad lines. But Hitler wanted to go into southern Russia. Hitler overruled him, and initially this drive was a success. In July 2 of 42, the Germans captured Sevastopol. 24th of July, Hitler got glowing reports of progress. Within 1 month, the Germans had advanced 300 miles to the Volga River near Stalingrad. The armies then split into 2 groups. General List to the south to Rostov and Bakai. Now, this was the group that was going down to the Caucasus. And if you had heard Gunther Ertel, he had been in the Battle of Moscow, had been wounded, came back, but he was with that 6th Army. But when the 6th Army, they split off to one group to the south and one towards Stalingrad, fortunately, he was with the group that went south. Then Hitler pulled the 4th Army from Group B and left General Paulus with only the 6th Army. August 14th, the 2nd Hungarian Army joined the battle, and they cleared the Don River elbow. The German generals told their troops, "We will have peace and quiet in Stalingrad and move into winter quarters and a chance of leaves for everybody." September, the Germans did move into the suburbs, and now close fighting takes place. Russia had special brigades and militia battalions. The Germans brought up special combat engineers and police units. Germans had heavy casualties. 6 battalion commanders were killed in one day in what they called the killing zones. Many companies were now reduced to 40 to 60 men. In October, Russia brought up the Russian Guards as shock troops for battle. and one particular division had 10,000 men. They were forced to go forward. Only 320 were alive at the end of the battle that day. The defense was commanded by a General Chukov. The fighting was extremely bitter, stalemate for several months. It was called a rat's war. Ruins, confusion, squad level, snipers. Russian would get, if they got 40 kills for snipers, they got the bravery medal. There were famous soldiers. One was Zatsev. He had 149 Germans. Another sniper by the name of Zhukov had 224 Germans that he killed. Many of you may have seen the movie Enemy at the Gate. That particular movie illustrated the snipers in some of the fighting that took place in Stalingrad. 600,000 people were in Stalingrad. 40,000 of the civilians were killed the first week of bombardment, which was very, very heavy. 300,000 of the civilians were evacuated to the east banks, but 50,000 were trapped on the west bank and were part of the fighting till the very end. A copy of the Red Star magazine, which was appealed to all the Russian soldiers. Do not count days. Do not count miles. Count only the number of Germans you have killed. Kill the German. This is your mother's prayer. Kill the German. This is the cry of your Russian earth. Do not waver. Do not let up. Kill. Hitler on September 28th in a speech vowed to capture Stalingrad. Russians had secret railways that they had moved 225,000 men, 7,000 guns, and 500 tanks unnoticed by the Germans. Initially, the Germans had control of the air. In October, Hitler pulled out 2 Luftwaffe squadrons and sent them to North Africa. He also pulled out a panzer division. And now General Paulus had only 2 panzer divisions and 17 infantry divisions. Then on the flanks, he added on the flanks were the Romanian, Hungarians, and Italian divisions. At one point, the Germans had about 3/4 of the city. In October, the Germans finally captured the tractor factory. November 5th, the Russians began to roll back Group B. November 11th, Russia's Paulus' last major attack. Heavy fighting. The Germans were now running out of food, ammunition, and they had now lost the air war. November 14th, General Zhukov and his massive reserve Siberian army arrived. They moved at night and crossed the Don River. There were now 500,000 fresh new infantry, 900 new T-34 tanks, and 1,000 attack planes. First, they hit the north flank, destroyed 7 Romanian divisions, and then they hit the south flank, routed a Romanian army in the 4th Panzer Division. Paulus requested evacuation to Hitler, and Hitler said no. November 23rd, the remaining Romanian division surrendered, and the Italian 8th Army was shattered. Hitler's staff meeting, Marshal Göring said, I can airlift 500 tons a day. Only 100 ever was received. The German Luftwaffe suffered a loss of 488 transport planes and 1,000 crew members. November, Mussolini pleaded with Hitler to withdraw from Russia. General Manstein was in the rear, the overall commander, and told Paulus to withdraw. Paulus obeyed Hitler instead of Manstein. He could have, at this point, broken through the lines, but he was told by Hitler not to retreat. Manstein pleaded with him, but no. Manstein then was to send an army to relieve the 6th Army that was now completely encircled. The 6th Army had consumed an average of 750 tons per day. Now they had only 6 small airfields and only 2 that even had radio beams. Maintenance was a problem. November 24th, only 22 of the 47 Ju-52s made the trip. By January 15th, only 1 airfield was left, and that was Gumik, and it was lost on January 22nd. 25,000 wounded could not get out. They stopped rations for them. Food was only for the able-bodied. General Manstein had 75,000 men, but weather was rotten. It took him just 18 days to assemble the force. He advanced within 22 miles of Paulus, but by December 25th, he too was in full retreat. Group A, that was down in the south, also now was being forced back. At this point, there was 318,000 troops encircled. Temperature was 39 degrees below zero. Many German soldiers were dying of malnutrition and physical exhaustion. 52,000 members of the 6th Army died between November 22nd and the end of January 1943. January, Hitler said, "You fight to the last man. You do not surrender." January 30th of 43, General Paulus was captured. He was actually surrounded inside Stalingrad. And Russia finally did release him in 1953 back to Germany. Many of the troops surrendered with him. On February 3rd, the remaining army surrendered, 33,000. Total captured is estimated between 90 and 110,000. Only 5,000 ever returned to Germany. These figures do not include the Hungarians, Romanians, and Italian troops. One of our members had an uncle in the Hungarian army that was at Stalingrad. They took the arms and told him, "Walk back to Hungary," and they did. Both his uncles walked all the way from Stalingrad back to Hungary and survived the war. 106,000 Germans were killed, total prisoners around 123,000. Soviet losses outnumbered the Germans even here 3-1. 55,000 of the prisoners died by April 15th at a camp called Bekatanka. They had a stack of bodies that was 100 yards long and 6 feet high. Chance of survival, 95% of the soldiers and the NCOs died, 55% of the junior officers, and just 5% of the senior officers. Historians agree that around 25,000 wounded and specialists were flown out. In the German army, at this point, they called them HIWI, Hiwis, which are Russians who were actually in the German army, and they estimate, and some of them were Cossacks that were in the German army at this time. And in that one report, they said the 6th Army had over 50,000 Russian auxiliaries attached to the frontline divisions, representing about a quarter of their strength. The 71st and 76th Infantry Divisions had over 8,000 Hiwis, or how you pronounce it, roughly the same number by mid-November. Well, obviously, if the Russians captured them, they killed them all. So that's what happened to them. Losses in the war. Russia had 13.7 million soldiers killed. 13.7 million. And 7 million civilians. Germany had 2 million soldiers killed. The Battle of Stalingrad and all the dying was primarily for the egos of Hitler and Stalin. Victory over fascism remains the greatest achievement that modern Russia can claim. And that's kind of the history, so I'll take some questions and we'll kind of go from there. I think if you look at the statistics, you can see what the odds were against the Germans for success. Look at the number of soldiers. In the most, 40 times the size of France And Hitler thought he was going to go through Russia the same way he went through France. The size of Russia is just tremendous. In the number of soldiers in the Russian army, we just don't know how many. Yes?
I would disagree with that a little bit. I think when Hitler invaded France, just a little louder.
Yeah.
Sorry, when Hitler invaded France in 1940, he had the correct idea. He knew that Paris was not Paris was not a major objective. What he did is he swung the tanks around up to around Calais, and that was a correct decision because the French capital almost fell without a shot. But in Russia, 1941 in June, I think General Guderian was in the town of Smolensk and was within 300 miles of Moscow, and the road to Moscow was open. Had Hitler at that time moved all of his troops from the north, or just half of his troops, maybe half of his troops from the Ukraine, and they captured Moscow, and Moscow was the center. Had they captured Moscow, it might have meant that the entire Russian communist regime would have collapsed because they would have had to move all of their supplies to Smolensk over the Urals to Kapitolina. So I'm not sure that that's. I mean, he had the right idea. He had the right idea in France, but he had the wrong idea in Russia.
Yeah, the problem is he had too much success initially.
Right.
And he was overconfident, totally misjudged in Russia. And we don't really know or tell. They were that close until when they were surrounded and had to escape. But they were that close. So again, rather than swing down towards Stalingrad, if they had made a northern push, they might have gotten Moscow. But don't forget, by this time, all the factories were way back. And these armies were building all the time. So even if they may have had a success, and maybe if they even captured Moscow, I don't think they'd have won the war. I really don't think they had a chance. The casualties were too great. Yes?
You know, was Zhukov a marshal at that time or just a general? Did that elevate him?
Zhukov, well, there were two heroes, Chekhov and Zhukov. Zhukov came in with the Siberian army. Zhukov was a hero already in that little war with Japan. But they did bring Zhukov back. But he did participate in a little bit in Leningrad. He was also in Moscow, and then they brought him into that new army into Stalingrad. So Zhukov was probably the biggest hero general that they had. But the sad part after the war, Stalin could not, they sent him off to a distant point, and Zhukov he just died in obscurity because Stalin was jealous of anybody who was a hero. Mm-hmm. Okay. In the back, yes?
A couple of points. The Russians never really acknowledged this, not even today, but the United States sent them over $11 billion worth of Lend-Lease, all in the form of all kinds of military material. That's one point I want to make. And another couple of observations is that I was over there in Russia 3 years ago. The distances are immense. Country 6,000 miles long, 3,000 miles wide. I remember traveling all day along the Russian steppe, not seeing anything. Not a bird. Once in a while, you might see a truck go down I won't even use the word road, or path, and then it would be enveloped completely in dust. So if you could imagine an army, especially the German army, going through there with tanks and trucks and stuff, imagine what all that dust did to the machinery and to the equipment and so forth. And also, when we see military cemeteries, here in the United States, abroad, nicely manicured with beautiful crosses lined up, you don't see that in Russia. The whole country is one big cemetery. Around Stalingrad, picture a football field, 100 yards long, X amount of yards wide, and there'll be a sign, unknown Hungarian soldiers buried here, unknown Russian soldiers buried here. No names, just a vast stretch of land with a marker indicating that thousands upon thousands of people had been killed. Yeah, it was a tremendous experience visiting some of those places. Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. Those of you who versed in literature like the Iliad and the Odyssey, there was this German archaeologist by the name of Schliemann, and he discovered the treasures of the Helen of Troy in Turkey, smuggled everything out of Turkey into Berlin, where it was housed into the Berlin Museum. As you know, the Russians conquered Berlin, took that treasure from centuries and millennia past into probably St. Petersburg, where it was there in their museum. And of course, in the siege by the Germans over there, I think it was the longest siege in military history, something like 900 days or something. Anyway, that beautiful treasure from years past has long been lost to the dust and ages of history. So there's all kinds of interesting stories as you travel through there. You mentioned a couple of books. Two I would add to that if you're interested in it. One is by Manstein himself, Lost Victories, and the other is by Zhukov, his memoirs. And they give you a nice overview of one side versus the other. But they're both heavily indoctrinated by politics. Zhukov credits Stalin and the general staff for his decisions, not wanting to offend the Communist Party. And Manstein, when he wrote his memoirs, was still very much attached to Nazism and the German cause. And so that tends to taint, the objectivity of both generals. But if you put the two together, along with the book that you mentioned, you get a pretty good idea. When I was there too, just to finish up, in Stalingrad, this Russian sniper by the name of Vasily Zaitsev, all he had was a common 7.62 millimeter Russian rifle from the Russian Revolution, put a scope on there and knocked off all of these Russian officers, these German officers. Interesting. Thank you. I enjoyed your remarks.
These 13 million boots, leather. The German army didn't have anything like that. I mean, this saved them from frostbite and everything else. I mean, look at all the planes we gave them. Look at those Studebaker trucks. That gave them mobility. They had probably more mobility from our Studebaker trucks than the German army. Most of the German army was using horses and mules to pull their guns and that. So, yeah, I don't think Russia has ever thanked us for what we did. It was a tremendous amount of Lend-Lease, and it probably kept them going at a very critical time. That's very, very true. Mm-hmm. I think we had another question. Yes?
That number of 20 million losses on the eastern side is often quoted. If that's attributed just to the Russians alone, it's military plus civilian, that's not entirely correct, because that included a lot of nations in Eastern Europe which subsequently became Soviet. And they were casualties even though they were not fighting on the Russian side, particularly the civilians.
I mean, when they give that 20 million.
Right. You have to be careful what kind of include.
Yeah, they keep saying 20 million.
I know,
Yeah,
20 million is always the
yeah,
number.
it is a figure they use. But a lot of people have no idea that how many Romanian troops were there, how many of the Hungarian troops and Italian.
And the civilians, when they went west, when they drove the Germans west, there were tremendous civilian casualties.
There was even one Spanish division on the Russian front, the Blue Division. Yeah, up in Leningrad. It got decimated up in Leningrad. Yes.
I know from reading about Battle of Stalingrad, Stalin refused to let the civilians leave Stalingrad because he figured the soldiers would fight for a live city more than they would fight for a dead city. And I know that helped attribute to a lot of the losses.
Yeah, 300,000 did get out, but 50,000 were not allowed to get out. So we don't know if that was a transportation problem or what. But Stalin was determined to hold on to it because it had his name on it. And Hitler kept bragging he was going to capture it. So it became an ego thing on both sides.
That tends to be an often overlooked period in military history. Secondly, one of the reasons I understand that Hitler refused to let Paulus retreat was Goring's claim that he could support this by air. And being totally outside of their capabilities at the time, when they tried, what they do in a lot of cases, in fact, with the entire Luftwaffe, they fall back on their instructors and their flight schools to maintain the crews. So if you lost X number of transport planes and their crews, you were losing the cream of the crop, your instructors, which affected you for the rest of the war.
Yeah, the Luftwaffe, they just had too many losses. They didn't have any more pilots. They could still produce the planes, but they didn't have the pilots. That's very, very true. Okay. Yes?
You mentioned that earlier Japan had attacked Russia short-lived, but then Hitler had calculated that Japan would attack again. Is that correct? And I'm wondering...
Well, who knows what was in his mind, but I think he actually thought that Japan was very victorious at this point, that they would again attack because they were kind of humiliated by how well. The Russians actually used blitzkrieg against the Japanese. The Japanese were shocked. They just couldn't, they were pushed back. The Japanese were pushed back, and it's only a war of 2 or 3 months. But he thought, well, now Japan's got a chance to attack. I don't know why. I don't know that he had any, but Russia had a spy in the inner circle in Japan and found out for sure Japan had no intentions. And that's when they pulled all the troops from the eastern front. Well, they had a couple million over there, thinking maybe Japan might, but when they brought all those, that turned the tide at Moscow, and it turned the tide at Stalingrad, very definitely, when those troops came in. They were well-trained troops, too, and they had their white uniforms, and a lot of them on skis. And yes?
Just to tag on to his point here, this battle that he referred to, the Battle of Kultendorf, along the Manchurian-Mongolian border, which ended up in this Japanese-Russian non-aggression pact, had tremendous repercussions at the end of the war. The Japanese thought they were going to go right through the Russian army what they had done. They didn't do that. They, of course, were reluctant to have a war on 2 fronts, America on the one side, Japan on the other. But there's a theory that the reason that the Japanese surrendered between the dropping of the 2 bombs was because during that time, Russia then declares war on Japan, and rushes through the Japanese army like a hot knife through butter. And there's some thought, Stephen Ambrose writes about this in his book, that you can build a case that the reason the Japanese surrendered was not only because of the dropping of the bomb, but also their fear of the Russian army coming into Japan and probably doing something to the emperor, similar to what they did to their own monarch back in 1917.
Yeah.
Russia did attack, but a lot of people don't know that strong up there had been already brought back to Japan because they thought we were going to invade. So many of those excellent troops that were up there in China and Manchuria were brought back and were in Japan at the time. So there wasn't too much opposition for the Russians to come down. Which again, you want another story is the invasion of Japan versus dropping of the bomb. That's a real debate. Over here.
Yeah, just another quick comment. There were, in fact, a lot of pilots that flew for the Luftwaffe that were in fact from Eastern Europe, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians. And it just so happens there was one Lithuanian that was from this area who died about 2 years ago. He was a Lithuanian pilot for the Luftwaffe, and he personally flew General von Fegelein, mostly from Berlin to the Eastern Front. Von Fegelein is notorious because he was actually the #2 SS man behind Heinrich Himmler. And he has the notoriety of being the very last person personally ordered to be shot by Adolf Hitler. He was the SS guy. Fegelein was married to Ada Braun's sister. And he was actually the SS liaison in Berlin in the bunker in 1945. And the day before Hitler committed suicide, he ordered that he be shot. And then that day or that very night, and the guy who flew Fegelein is actually from this area. He used to fly from Berlin to Ukraine and to the front and back. So it's historically.
There's a lot of arguments that if the Germans had not persecuted and had not treated the civilians as severely, that they could have had even more support. One of the first discussions I had with this Russian-German soldier, Arthur, was he told me, he says, there were 1 million Russians in the German army. And I said, I don't believe it. So I had to research it, and he's right, because not a lot of Ukrainians, and then, of course, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, those were all very anti-Russian, and a lot of them joined. And so a lot of the different nationalities had a hatred of Russia itself. It did join the German army. And a lot of people don't know. I had a client who was from Croatia, and in his community, it was a German community. And he graduated from high school in 1938. There were 23 men in his graduating class. All 23 joined the German army. All 23 went to Russia. And down to most of them were casualties. By the end of the war, there was only one that had not been wounded or killed, and he was wounded in the last month of the war. And my fellow was wounded 2 or 3 times.
The library will be closing in 30 minutes. At that time, all computer terminals will be shut down and no further checkouts will take place. If you do not have a library card or you're unsure the library card you have is valid, we ask that you come to our circulation desk on the first floor at this time. For all other patrons, begin making your final selections and check out. Thank you.
So really, when you say the German army, it could have been Germans from Southern Europe, could have been part of, it could have been a Russian. So very, very confusing. But it's quite in the back, yes.
Simple question. The Russians, the Germans, and all the ones that fought, how old were their troops? What were the younger troops? What were the older troops? Did they have a cutout?
Well, Russia had a large population, so they had more to draw on. But they'd go into a town, like in Moscow, and every man between 17 and 70 probably was put into the army at some point to defend Moscow. So they were all ages. Many Russian civilians were put into digging trenches and so forth around these cities. And if you didn't participate, they'd shoot you. So they were all ages. Now, talk about the German army. Well, they were being depleted so rapidly, they got down to the last few months of the war, they were drafting 15-year-olds, drafting them up to the age, I think, 60 or 65. So many of the troops towards the end of the war were very young and very old. Okay, we got any question? Yes.
Is it known what the plans were post Stalingrad for the Germans? Did they have plans beyond that of where they were gonna head and do after that?
Well, some of the historians argue that really Stalingrad was not worth it. They should have gone around it and could have. The oil was the main thing. If they'd have gone completely down and gotten the oil, or if they'd gone up towards Moscow and cut the railroad and supplies off. So what did really Stalingrad, as I say, it was an emotional. Stalin, because of the name, and Hitler was going to get Stalingrad. So, yeah, it's a good question why they made such a battle, and real tragedy. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, yeah.
This is one more broad than the subject, but am I correct in thinking the total deaths in World War II were about 31 million?
Civilian and well, if we take civilian and military both, I think the figure is probably closer to 50 million. You consider China lost a tremendous number. China probably lost almost as many as maybe Russia did. And, you know, we're not really sure. There are tremendous casualties out of some of those countries, of Romania and Hungary and Poland also.
I can give you a total figure, but I've heard several times for the total losses in war in the 20th century, and that's 120 million. 120 million. But when you consider the world population grew from 2 billion to 6 billion,
So you're including, when I figure World War I, World War II, okay, the
all
century.
wars in the century.
Okay,
Not just our wars, everybody's wars.
okay. Well, World War I did not have many civilian casualties. World War II had a lot of civilian casualties. This guy did not have any big companies behind him, and he had the United States didn't take the T-34, but Russia did. Yeah. Yes.
You talk about all the equipment that America supplied to Russia, and all the tanks and vehicles that we gave them. They absolutely hated them because they considered them inferior to what they had with the T-34.
Well, they liked their boots.
Yeah,
they liked their They liked their Studebaker, and yeah, even Ertel said he saw a lot of those Studebaker trucks, and so.
Well, the Germans never had a standardized vehicle when they invaded Russia. They had a whole conglomeration of this and that, and different parts and different, it was a mess.
Yeah, they really, to tackle an invasion of Russia with what they needed, they really weren't equipped to do that. I mean, statistically, we look at all the facts, the size, the number, and all the, what chance did Germany really have? When you can put all the facts together, you just think, what chance did they really have? And it was a real disaster for them. Yeah, Ertel, I don't know whether he told you when he talked to your group or not, in the battle, by his company of 300 men, by the time they got pushed back from Moscow, there was only 17 of them still standing. 17 out of 300, yeah. He suffered tremendously. The only way you ever got out of there was if you were wounded or seriously ill, and you get out of the Russian front. So, okay, coming up pretty well. Okay.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it a great deal.